I've stood outside Buckingham Palace maybe a dozen times in my life. I've watched the changing of the guard, I've taken the photographs, I've done the whole thing. But I have never, not once, seen a moment like what happened on that cold Tuesday morning in November. And I wasn't even supposed to be there. Set up, I'd missed my train to Edinburgh by 11 minutes. 11. The kind of thing that makes you want to sit on the pavement and have a quiet moment of self-pity. So rather than go back to the hotel and stare at the ceiling, I decided to walk. London does that to you when you don't know what to do, you just walk, and eventually something finds you. It was 9:30 in the morning. The sky was the color of old dishwater, that flat grey you only get in England in November, where the light never quite arrives properly. It was cold, but not brutally so, just enough that people had their scarves on and their chins tucked down. The kind of cold that makes the city feel smaller and more private than it really is. I ended up on the Mall almost by accident. One of those long, straight London roads that feels ceremonial even when nothing is happening, lined with those black lampposts and the flags sitting limp in the still air. There were tourists around, not the summer crowds, but the autumn ones, the more serious kind, the ones who actually read the plaques and take their time. A school group from somewhere European was gathered near the Victoria Memorial, a teacher counting heads with the exhausted patience of someone who had been counting heads since 6 that morning. A couple was taking photographs of the palace gates, one of them holding the other's coffee while they framed the shot. A man in a bright orange anorak was eating a sandwich directly in front of a no cycling sign, which I thought was funny. Life was ordinary. The kind of ordinary that makes a city feel comfortable. The palace itself looked the way it always does, enormous, somehow both grand and blank at the same time, like a building that has learned not to show what it's thinking. The Union flag was flying, which meant the king was not in residence. The forecourt was quiet. The guards were at their posts. I stopped near the memorial, not for any particular reason. I wasn't in a rush anymore. My rescheduled train wasn't until 1. I just stood there with my hands in my pockets, watching the forecourt the way you do when you have nowhere to be, idly, without expectation. That's usually when things happen, I've found. When you stop expecting them. Build tension. There were 2 guards visible from where I was standing. They do the slow ceremonial walk, back and forth along a short stretch of the forecourt, and they don't look at you. That's the whole point. The eyes are fixed ahead, the face is a mask, the boots hit the stone with that precise, almost mechanical rhythm. They're not ignoring you, exactly. It's more that you've simply ceased to exist in their world. It's one of those British things, a performance of absolute indifference that takes enormous discipline to maintain. I noticed one of the guards first because of his stillness. He had stopped his walk, which in itself is not unusual. They pause and turn, it's part of the movement, but this pause was different. He was standing near the inner side of the gate, and his posture had changed. Not dramatically. Nothing a tourist snapping a quick photo would have caught. But when you're standing still yourself, with nothing else to look at, you notice these things. His shoulders had shifted slightly. Just marginally, a kind of micro-tension that ran through the whole top half of his body. His eyes, which should have been pointing directly ahead at some fixed, invisible point on the horizon, had moved. Not much. A fraction. But they had moved. He was looking at something to his left. Toward a secondary entrance, not the main gate, but one of those narrower access points that service and official vehicles use, set slightly back from the main tourist view. There was a vehicle there. A dark car, official-looking, with the quiet, polished stillness of something that belongs. A figure had stepped out. I couldn't see clearly from where I was. The light was behind them, and the distance was enough that details became impressions. But the impression was of a woman. Well-dressed. Moving with purpose. She wasn't hurrying, but her walk had that quality you see in people who are used to arriving somewhere and having things adjust around them. I thought nothing of it at first. Palace staff, I assumed. Someone official. The guard's slight reaction meant nothing to me in that moment, just a flicker, quickly corrected, his eyes snapping back to their proper place. But then, there was another car. This one came from the opposite direction, sweeping along the internal road with that heavy, smooth movement of a well-armored vehicle. It stopped. And, from it stepped someone I did recognize. Even at that distance, there are certain people whose silhouette carries a kind of weight. The posture, the way the coat sat, the deliberate, practiced manner of someone who has been photographed 10,000 times and knows, in the marrow of their bones, how to move through a space without appearing to perform. Queen Camilla. I know how that sounds. I know how these things go. People think they spot royals everywhere in London, the way Americans think they see celebrities in Los Angeles. But I've lived near enough to this world, grown up watching the footage, the documentaries, the news coverage, and there are people whose physical presence has a quality that photographs don't quite capture, a kind of undeniable realness. She was accompanied by two people. An aide, walking a half step behind on her right. And a protection officer, obvious from the posture, the earpiece just visible, the way his eyes moved over the space before his feet did. She was heading toward the same secondary entrance. Toward the first woman. And, now the guard at the gate, my guard, the one I'd been watching, was very, very still. Not the ceremonial stillness. Something different. Something internal. Climax. I want to be honest about what I could and couldn't hear. I was behind the gate, outside it, on the public side. Sound travels strangely in open spaces, especially when there's a low ambient noise of traffic and wind. I could hear fragments. I could hear tone. I could not hear every word, and I will not pretend I could. But what I could see was more than enough. The two women met near the entrance. And something immediately felt wrong, not dangerous, but charged. The aide who had accompanied Queen Camilla took a small, instinctive step to the side, the way people do when they sense they are about to be in the middle of something they shouldn't witness. The protection officer remained stationary, but his attention sharpened visibly. And then, I realized who the first woman was. I'd seen her in photographs more times than I could count, the younger face, the particular way she wore her hair, the posture that comes from a lifetime of being a princess and knowing what that means. Princess Anne. The Princess Royal. In person she was exactly as she appears in every image, precise, no nonsense, with the kind of face that has never suffered a moment it considered worth hiding. She was not smiling. Queen Camilla said something. I couldn't catch it. Short. A greeting, or perhaps something beyond a greeting, something that opened a conversation that was already in progress somewhere, the way royals speak to each other, picking up threads that have been running for decades underneath the public surface. Anne replied. And what I caught, because her voice was clearer, carrying with that clipped, direct English vowel that doesn't dissipate the way softer voices do, was something that stopped me cold. It wasn't the words exactly. It was the quality of them. Flat, deliberate, the tone of someone setting something down on a table and stepping back from it. She was not angry in the explosive sense. She was worse than angry. She was certain. Camilla's aide took another small step backward. And, then, the guard moved. Not in the way guards move when there's a threat, that's a different motion entirely, faster, purposeful in a specific direction. This was something else. He turned. He stepped. He placed himself, and, I mean placed, with full intention, in the sightline between the two women and the public gate. Between them and me. Between them and the cluster of tourists who had, in the last 60 seconds, begun to drift toward the gate with cameras half raised, with that tourist instinct for something interesting without quite knowing what that something is. He was not blocking them. He was shielding them. It was so subtle, and so complete, that I almost didn't understand what I was watching. He had created a wall, not of glass or stone but of uniform and presence and trained stillness, between one of the most private moments I had ever accidentally witnessed and the watching world outside. And he did it without being told. No communication in his earpiece that I could see, no visible signal from the protection officer, no gesture from the aide. He simply read the room, read the moment, and moved. I've thought about that a lot since. About what it means to be trained so completely for something that your instincts and your duty become the same thing. There was no hesitation in him. No calculation. He moved the way water moves through the path of least resistance, not because someone told him to, but because he understood, in his bones, what was needed. Inside the gate, the conversation continued. I couldn't see faces now, only shoulders, gestures, the tilt of a head. But I could see the shape of it, two women who had known each other for a very long time, who existed in the same extraordinary world, having a conversation that had weight to it. Real weight. The kind that doesn't dissolve when it's over. At one point, and made a gesture. A small one. The kind you make when you've said the thing you came to say, and now it exists, and what happens next is up to someone else. Camilla was still for a moment. Longer than felt comfortable, even at my distance. Then, she turned, very slightly, toward her aide. Said something quiet. The aide nodded once and withdrew. And then, and I still don't know entirely what to make of this, Queen Camilla laughed. Not the polished, public laugh. Not the one you see at walkabouts and charity events, warm but managed. This was something smaller and more private. Something that seemed to surprise even her. As if the thing Anne had said, whatever it was, had punctured something, and what came out wasn't quite what she'd expected. Anne's expression didn't change. But something in her stance did. A slight, almost invisible easing. As if permission had been granted for something to be done with. Resolution had lasted maybe 4 minutes in total. Probably less. These things always feel longer when you're inside them, even as a peripheral witness. The cars arranged themselves. The aide reappeared. Princess Anne said one more thing, brief, practical sounding, and then walked back to her vehicle with that characteristic stride, no drama, no looking back. The door closed. The car moved. Queen Camilla remained for a moment. Her protection officer said something to her, low, just for her. She nodded. And then, she too moved back toward the palace entrance, her coat catching slightly in the wind that had decided, at precisely that moment, to arrive. The guard returned to his post. He walked back to his position with the exact same rhythm as before. Boots on stone. Eyes forward. That ceremonial pace that says nothing and everything at once. He stood at his mark, and he was again the postcard version of himself, the unmovable, the ceremonial, the symbol. No one around me had understood what they'd just seen. The tourist couple had their photograph of the gate, blurry and slightly tilted. The European school group was moving away toward the memorial. The man in the orange anorak had finished his sandwich and was studying a map. I stood there for another few minutes, not quite ready to leave. There's something strange about accidentally witnessing a real moment inside a world that usually keeps its real moments so carefully hidden. The palace sits there every day, on every postcard, in every tourist's photograph, and it looks like a backdrop. Like a stage set. Like something built for looking at rather than living in. But people live in it. Complicated people, with long histories and real feelings and things they need to say to each other in car parks on cold November mornings. The guard knew that. That's why he moved. My cousin Delphine works in hospitality. Has done for 15 years. Hotels, private events, state functions. She's poured champagne into glasses for people whose names you'd recognize and whose faces she's learned to treat as simply faces. She says the most important skill she ever developed is the ability to be invisible. To move through a room full of extraordinary people and register nothing on her face. To hear things without listening, to see things without looking. She told me what happened that afternoon at Windsor. And she told me in the same quiet voice she uses for everything, sitting across a kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold while she was talking. Like she was still deciding, even as the words came out, how much of it she was allowed to say. I'm telling you what she told me. I'm not embellishing. I don't think I need to. Set up, it was a private luncheon. That's the official way to describe it, though in royal circles, private is a relative term. There were perhaps 30 people present, a mixture of family, senior household staff, and individuals connected to various charitable foundations that Princess Anne has supported for years. It was held in one of Windsor's interior reception rooms, not the grand public-facing ones that feature in the documentaries, but a smaller space, more intimate, with tall windows that looked onto the inner courtyard and caught the pale October light in long, quiet rectangles across the floor. Delphine had been brought in as supplementary staff. The regular household team sometimes calls in trusted extras for events of a certain size, people with proper clearance and a known record. She had worked Windsor before, twice, and had the particular training required. She knew the rhythms. She knew the language of these spaces, the way a room shifts when a principal enters, the invisible reorganization of attention that happens when rank moves through a door. She was stationed near the far end of the room, closest to the windows, managing one of the side tables. A supporting role. The kind of role that requires you to stay exactly in your quadrant of the room, to read the need before it's expressed, and, above all, to ensure that whoever you're serving never has to notice you're there. She said the room was warm. Not uncomfortably so, but the kind of warmth that comes from many people gathered in a space with old walls that hold heat slowly and release it slowly, so by midday the temperature has a weight to it. There were flowers, autumn ones, burnt orange and deep red, arranged with that apparently casual precision that takes hours to achieve. The kind of flowers that tell you someone thought hard about making things look uncontrived. The lunch had been running about 40 minutes when Delphine noticed the shift. Build tension, she said. It started with the seating. Not a dramatic rearrangement, nothing so obvious. But someone who understood these events, who knew the formal logic of who sat where and what it meant, would have spotted it. Princess N, who had been at the head of the central arrangement, had her chair not moved exactly, but angled. Turned, by a fraction, in the direction of where Queen Camilla was seated, 3 places down on the adjacent table. A small thing. The kind of thing a room full of civilians would not have registered. But Delphine registered it, because she registers everything, and because the household staff member nearest the central table had made that small adjustment with an expression of focused neutrality that, in her experience, means someone above them in the hierarchy has made a request that required thinking about. She started watching. Not obviously, she never does anything obviously. But, with that particular peripheral awareness that service work trains into you. The conversation at the central tables was social, pleasant, the ordinary pleasant hum of a formal lunch in its comfortable middle stage. People leaning across to speak. Laughter from the far end. The soft percussion of cutlery. But, underneath it, Delphine said, between the two women, there was a different conversation. Not hostile, not even tense in a way she could easily explain. More like, and this is how she put it, like 2 chess players who are still smiling for the photograph but have already looked ahead 12 moves and are deciding whether to admit it. She watched Camilla speak at one point. She watched the words travel toward an end, she watched and received them. And, she said, Anne's response, she couldn't hear it, but she watched it happen, was delivered with a stillness that she found slightly startling. Not coldness. Stillness. The difference being that cold is a reaction, and stillness is a choice. Then, one of the guards assigned to interior security walked the length of the room. He was doing a routine pass. These happen periodically, unannounced but unremarkable, part of the background architecture of a royal event. Tall man, late 30s at a guess, the kind of face that has trained itself to be present without participating. He moved along the wall with the quietness of someone who has learned to subtract himself from rooms. Delphine said he paused. Not dramatically, just a small, precise pause, near the pillar at the far end, where his sightline gave him the full room but gave the room less of him. And, she said she could see, in the almost invisible tightening around his eyes, that he, too, was reading something in the air that wasn't in the schedule. She made very careful eye contact with him across the room. The kind of look that in her world means, I see it too. Stay placed. He gave her nothing back. Absolutely nothing. But, he didn't move from his pillar. Climax. The moment that Delphine says she will not forget happened about 20 minutes later, in the small interval between the main course being cleared and the dessert service beginning. These few minutes, she explained, are always slightly unstructured. The formal rhythm of the meal pauses, conversations fragment and reform, people shift in their chairs, the room breathes. It was in this pause that Princess Anne spoke. Not to the room. Just to Queen Camilla. low, even, the kind of voice that doesn't need to be raised to reach its target. Delphine was 3 or 4 meters away, moving between tables, and she heard the sentence, not quite whole, a fragment, really, but enough. The way you catch the last few notes of a song from another room and still know what it is. What she caught was this: something about a decision, a word like unilateral used in the flat, factual way and uses words, like nails being placed on a surface, and then, a phrase about what had been said to whom, and when, and in what order. The order seemed to matter. The order was, if Delphine understood correctly, the actual point. There was a silence that followed. Camilla looked at her hands for a moment. Not downward, not the gesture of someone ashamed or chastened. More sideways, the way you look at something when you're thinking about it honestly rather than performing. Her aide was not present at this moment. Her protection officer was at the far door. The only people close enough to have registered anything were Delphine, the interior guard still stationed at his pillar, and a household staff member whose back was turned. Then, Camilla said something back. And here is where Delphine's account gets interesting, because she said Camilla's response surprised her. She expected, if she's being honest, something diplomatic. Something that managed the moment, smoothed it, rolled it back to safe ground with the practiced grace of someone who has been navigating this family's internal weather for 2 decades. That was what the situation seemed to call for. Instead, Camilla said something that appeared to concede a point. Not everything. Not an apology, or not exactly. Delphine wasn't close enough to be certain of the exact shape of it. But, a concession. A genuine one, from the quality of it. The kind that costs something. And was quiet for 3 or 4 seconds. And, then, she said one word. Just one. And, the word was, good. That was it. That was the exchange. But, here's the part one want you to understand, because this is the part Delphine came back to twice while she was telling me. The guard at the pillar had, at some point in the last minute, moved. Barely. Perhaps 18 inches from his original position, closer to the room's center, angling himself so that his body was between the 2 women and the wider field of vision of anyone on the far side of the room who might have been paying closer attention than appropriate. He hadn't been asked to do this. Delphine was certain of that. She knows the signals, she knows the earpiece cues, she knows how protection direction looks when it's been given. This had not been given. He had simply decided. On his own reading of the room. On his own understanding of what these 2 women needed in that moment, which was 45 seconds of being allowed to have a real conversation without 28 other people catching it. When the dessert service began and the room reorganized itself around the arrival of new things, he drifted back to the wall. Easy as breathing. No one looked at him. No one would have remembered him being anywhere else. Delphine said she looked at him once more before the service ended. He was back at his position. Back to the blank, watchful, ceremonial face. And, she thought, just for a second, that she saw something in the set of his jaw. Not satisfaction, exactly. Too small for that. Too private. More like, done. Resolution. The lunch concluded. These things have their formal closings, the chairs pushed back in a certain way, the leave-taking conducted in a particular order, which is not quite protocol but not quite not protocol either. Princess and left first. She spoke briefly to 3 people on her way out, each conversation conducted with that characteristic efficiency that some people mistake for abruptness but which is actually just the absence of wasted time. She shook hands. She smiled once, a real smile at something someone said, and then she was gone. Camilla remained for another 20 minutes. She was different in the latter part of the afternoon, Delphine said. Not dramatically different, nothing that the room at large would have read. But, softer in some quality she couldn't precisely name. As if something that had been held at a certain tension had been released by a few degrees. She spoke more easily. She laughed more readily. She thanked the household staff individually on her way out, which she apparently always does, but this time it felt less like courtesy and more like she was genuinely present for it. Delphine was packing down the side table when the interior guard passed her on his way out. He didn't look at her. He was facing forward, back to the professional remove that was, she understood, his natural state. But, as he passed, he said, barely above a murmur, not breaking stride, "Good service today." Not to her specifically, or not obviously. Maybe to the room. Maybe to no one. But, she heard it. And, she knew that he knew she'd understood what he was really saying, which had nothing to do with the canapes. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over London in the hour before rain. The city doesn't go quiet exactly, it never fully goes quiet, but it shifts. The traffic thins, the pigeons disappear, the light turns that specific shade of bruised yellow that feels like the sky holding its breath. If you've lived here long enough, you learn to read it. You button your coat. You change your route. You find a doorway. I found one outside St. James's Palace. Which is how I ended up seeing what I saw. And, I want to be clear about something before I tell you this, I am not a journalist. I have no agenda. I'm a freelance architect on my way to a site meeting that got postponed by text message at the exact wrong moment, standing in a doorway on Marlborough Road with my collar up and my phone in my hand and the rain beginning to arrive in that decisive, London way, where it starts as possibility and immediately becomes fact. I didn't plan to see any of this. But, I saw it. All of it. Set up St. James's Palace sits differently in the London landscape than Buckingham does. Buckingham is a statement, it wants to be seen, faces the road, presents itself. St. James's is older and more complicated, built in the 1530s, all red brick and leaded windows and a gatehouse that looks like it belongs to a different century entirely, which of course it does. It sits slightly back from things, doesn't announce itself. There's a quiet authority to it, the kind that doesn't need to perform because it has survived long enough to simply exist. I'd been past it 100 times and barely thought about it. It's one of those London landmarks that gets absorbed into the background, like the river or the weather. The place where ambassadors are still received, where certain ceremonies happen, where history does its ongoing, low-level business without making too much noise about it. On this particular evening, late October, the city already in its early dark winter mode, the streetlights coming on at 4:30 with a kind of apologetic efficiency, the area around the palace had a specific quality. Not busy. Not deserted. That middle London state where there are always people, but they're all moving, all going somewhere, not gathering. I was the only one standing still, which made me feel conspicuous, though no one was looking. The rain was serious by 5:05. I had shifted as far into the doorway as possible, which was not very far. My site meeting notes were getting damp at the edges of my bag. I was checking the weather app in a kind of performative optimism, as if the radar would have different information than the sky directly above me. That's when the car came around the corner. One car first. Then, a second, very close behind it. Then, a third, which tucked itself against the palace wall with that decisive stop that meant it wasn't going anywhere for a while. Official vehicles. The kind that carry a certain gravity in how they park. Build tension. Two figures came out of the second car quickly, protection officers, from the posture, moving with the contained efficiency that's different from any other kind of purposeful movement. Not urgent, but certain. They established their positions in the time it takes most people to close a car door. Then, someone from the palace side opened a pedestrian gate near the gatehouse, a side access, not the main ceremonial entrance. A woman came through it. I knew who it was because of the coat. Green, wool, that specific shade that's appeared in 100 different photographs over the years, and the way she wore it, collar up, practical, unhurried, as if the rain were simply a context and not a difficulty. Princess and doesn't battle weather. She acknowledges it and continues. She was alone, or as alone as she ever is. One aide, a woman in her 40s, following at a pace that suggested she was used to keeping up. And came through the gate and stopped. She looked at the cars arranged in the road with an expression that Delphine, no, wait, this is my account, my own eyes, that I can only describe as calibrating. She was working something out. The quick, private arithmetic of a person who has spent 70 years in this world and knows how all the pieces move. The rear door of the first car opened. And that's when Camilla stepped out. No aide with her, which surprised me, even from this distance, in this rain, that felt notable. Her protection officer had positioned himself at the far side of the vehicle, enough distance to provide the standard security perimeter but not close enough to be part of whatever came next. She was wearing navy, a long coat, her hair slightly disrupted by the wind that was moving with the rain now and making the whole scene feel more exposed and less choreographed than these things usually are. She said something immediately. I could see the words in the movement of her face but couldn't reach them from where I was, across the road and into the sound of rain on stone. And didn't move. She listened. Her aide had drifted back, I noticed this, to a position near the gate, just inside the wall, just out of clear earshot. Giving the principal space. Good instinct. And the guard at the gatehouse, the one stationed near the inner side of the pedestrian entrance, visible to me in the yellow spill of the lamplight inside the gate, he was watching. Not the women. The street. The approach roads. The space around. But his posture was wrong. Wrong in the way that said he was aware of exactly what was happening behind him, even without looking directly at it, and that awareness had settled into him the way a weight settles into something, changing its whole center of gravity without moving it from the spot. He was standing differently than he had been 60 seconds ago. Something was happening that he hadn't been briefed for. Climax. I have tried, since that evening, to be responsible about what I relay and what I keep to myself. There are things that felt too private to repeat: gestures, the specific character of certain silences, the texture of what passed between two people in the rain on a London road with no audience except a wet architect and a guard who was doing his best to be somewhere else without moving his feet. But there are things I can say. At one point, and made a gesture that I've been thinking about ever since. She raised one hand, not dramatically, not pointing, not directed at Camilla, but opened it, palm up, briefly. Like she was placing something down. Or presenting something. Here. This. The thing I've been carrying. I'm setting it down now in front of you, and what you do with it is yours. Camilla looked at the open hand for a moment. She was maybe 6 feet from him, the rain moving diagonally between them and the lamplight like static. And she did something that I didn't expect, and which I think about more than anything else from that evening. She nodded. Not quickly. A full, considered nod. The kind that means I understand, not as a social courtesy, but as an actual, private admission of having understood. Then, she spoke. Several sentences. And I watched Anne's face as she received them, and Anne's face was, and this is the right word, I checked it against every other word I could find, relieved. Not happy, not resolved in any simple sense, but the specific quality of a face that has been holding something taut for a long time and can, now, relax it. Just a degree. Just enough. They stood there for a moment without speaking. In the rain. In the lamplight. Two women who share one of the most complicated inheritances in the world, not just the crown and its weight, but the decades of relationships inside it, the losses, the adjustments, the loyalty given and withheld and renegotiated, the things said and the things never said, the enormous silent work of a family that is also an institution and must be both at once, always, in public and in private and in the rain on a Tuesday evening in October. And the guard moved. He didn't go toward them. He went away from them, but away in a very specific direction. He stepped out to the entrance of the gate, positioning himself at the edge of the lamplight, his back to the women, facing the street. The empty, rain-wet street with its moving headlights and its nobody in particular. Except me. And I realized, in a slow, cold way that had nothing to do with the weather, that he had seen me. He had, at some point in the last few minutes, registered the person in the doorway across the road. He had assessed me, my stillness, my position, the angle of my attention. And he had made a decision. He wasn't looking at me the way someone looks at a threat. He was looking at me the way someone looks at something they've decided to keep in their peripheral vision while allowing it to remain where it is. A watching presence acknowledged and managed without confrontation. He was simply, and completely, between the two women and my sightline. He had narrowed what I could see. Slightly, but intentionally. His shoulder, his height, the placement of his body against the lamplight, he was editing the frame. Making certain that the most private parts of whatever was happening behind him remained private. And here is the thing that I will carry with me from that evening. he did it without ever looking at the women. Without turning. Without checking. He trusted his own reading of the room, the road, the rain, the person in the doorway, and he placed himself accordingly, and he held his position, and he looked at nothing in particular, and said nothing, and waited. I stood there for perhaps 2 more minutes. Then, I stepped back further into the doorway, not because I was embarrassed exactly, but because it felt like the right thing to do. Like I had been in something I hadn't earned access to, and decency required me to remove myself from it. I looked at my phone. I looked at the rain. I did not look at the road. Resolution: when I came out of the doorway again, maybe 5 minutes later, the road was quiet. The cars were gone. The gate was closed. The lamplight lay on the whetstones and caught nothing in particular. There was one guard visible. I couldn't tell if it was the same one. The light was different, and the angle was different, and they have that trained sameness of presentation that is, on some level, the whole point. He was standing at his post with the usual precise immobility, facing forward, as if the rain and the cars and the women and whatever had happened in the lamplight were simply the unremarkable background of another evening shift. I walked to my train. I ate a sandwich on the platform that I didn't taste. I sat on the train and watched London pass in the dark windows, that reverse mirror of the city at night, light and shadow running backward, and I thought about what it means to witness something you weren't supposed to witness. Not in a legal sense. Not even in a moral sense, really. Just in the human sense. The sense in which some moments belong to the people inside them, and the decent thing, the truly decent thing, is to understand that and step back. The guard had understood that long before I did. He understood it professionally. He understood it instinctively. He understood it in whatever private way he understood things, because of course he's a full person, with his own interior life, his own reading of the world, his own sense of what dignity means and what it costs when it isn't protected. He protected it that evening. Not the crown, not the office, not the ceremony. The moment. The 2 women in the rain who needed 60 seconds that no one else would see. He gave them that. I thought about Delphine's story, which I'd heard a few weeks before. I thought about the guard outside the palace gates, whom someone had described to me over coffee last winter. And I thought about how the same story keeps happening in different locations, in different weather, with different faces, and the constant in it is always this: someone in a uniform, standing where they're told to stand, seeing something they weren't meant to see, and choosing, with no instruction and no audience, to do the right thing. It would have cost that guard nothing to stand exactly where he was. No one would have known. I might not have even noticed the women properly through the rain. The moment might have been fine regardless. But he moved anyway. Because he understood that probably fine isn't the same as protected. And his job, not the ceremonial part, but the real part, was to protect. I don't know his name. I never will. That's as it should be. But I walked away from St. James's Palace that evening feeling something I hadn't expected. Something quiet and specific. It took me most of the train journey to locate the word for it. Gratitude. That was it. For a stranger in a gatehouse who knew what mattered and guarded it with nothing more than his body and his judgment and his willingness to stand in the rain.